thread-safe code. And by thread-safe, I mean a whole bunch of special synchronization-related code to make sure that only one person can call this function at any given time. The reality is, it's just not going to happen. By convention, this does not need to be atomic code. And by specifying that it should be non-atomic, it makes the getter and or setter faster. So we won't see in the coming weeks really an instance where you need atomic. And technically, it's there just because atomic is the default. And I want my getter and setter to perform ever so slightly faster, even though we humans would never notice.
It's awesome. Like, you are responsible for that Apple or the open source. Like, can we just go in there and look at something?
Good question. Are they open source? You can see the header files, the .h files, but to my knowledge, not the actual implementation files, at least not from recent versions of iOS. There may very well be older versions floating around. All we get is the compiled versions of those files and the header files, which are readable. All right. Yes?
Can you give us an example of when you would have to use the atomic?
If you are writing when would you use atomic as an attribute? If you are writing code that supports multiple threads, so two things happening at once, and each of those threads might want to access some value. So let me contrive an example offhand. So iOS now supports printing capabilities. So for instance, if you had some program that allows you to print your notes, for instance, in the Notes application, if the Notes application were multi-threaded, so it could do two things at once, and one of those things happened to be printing, and another thing happened to be editing, which surely the Notes application supports, if the printing application, the printing feature, needed to read the contents of your note, the contents of your note might be implemented by way of an instance variable and accessed by way of a getter and setter implemented as a property. Meanwhile, I, the human, with my fingers, might want to actually be editing that same note, and therefore the editing feature might also need to read and or write, get and or set that instance variable through this property. And it's probably not a good thing if I allow both the printing functionality and the editing functionality to look at the value and change that value at the same time, because I might say print now, make some changes, and all of a sudden my printer starts printing out part of the old version and part of the new version, unless I've somehow locked access to that file. So it's contrived in the sense that you can do things so fast that that's not going to happen. And you can make a copy, in theory, of the instance variable and void that problem altogether. But that's the spirit of it. If two things might simultaneously try to read and or write the same value, bad things can happen, like garbled printouts in that case. Yes?
What is the other option? Like the third one is read-write. If you typed in read-write, what else could it be?
Read-only. Read-only is another.
What would that do?
Read-only gives you a getter but no setter. Good question. And strong, this one's more easily explained in the future after some number of examples, because it refers to memory management, in particular that automatic reference counting feature that I alluded to earlier. And we'll see this in the context of some GUIs that we actually start programming. So we will revisit. All right, so appdelegate.m is the last place for this program. And recall that this program only loaded a white screen. So all of this effort just to load a white screen, but we'll see in our next example that you can do much more with relatively little additional effort. So this file is a little overwhelming, but thanks to the green lines here, it turns out it's mostly comments. So it's just boilerplate code that Apple provides, and we can actually delete most of this just to simplify. So let me zoom out just to get the lay of the land. On the top of the file, we have some comments. I'm importing appdelegate.h. So appdelegate.m is importing appdelegate.h, common paradigm for the methods file to import the header file. At implementation appdelegate, what does this mean? Translate that one line of code. What's that line of code telling Xcode? Yeah. Exactly. Here comes the implementation of the class called appdelegate, which was declared in the file called appdelegate.h. So this method is hugely named. Application, actually, good opportunity for review. What is the name of this method? Or more precisely, what is the name of the selector? Yes?
Application : did finish with launching with options :
Good. Good. And as humans, we typically wouldn't say the colons, but it's exactly right. They're part of the name of the method. So application did finish launching with options. So Objective-C, recall, supports essentially some variant of named parameters, where they're not named in the sense that they appear inside of parentheses, as might be common as key value pairs or as JSON objects in the world of JavaScript programming, but the names of methods in Objective-C are meant in spirit to read like, frankly, full-out sentences. So they do exactly what they say. So what does this one do? I honestly have no idea at first glance. It seems to be code that someone else wrote. Indeed, Apple put it in this template for me. But then there's a few lines of implementation inside of it. Let's take a look here. Self.window gets UI window alloc, init with frame, UI screen, main screen bounds. All right, this looks like probably the most complex line of Objective-C code we've seen thus far, but it's really just the combination of very simple building blocks. So someone on the left-hand side, what is self.window referring to? What is that? This window? It's referring to this program's window, and how about more technically underneath the hood? What is self.window, W-I-N-D-O-W, referring to? The view, close. The property. So window, recall, was the name of the property that we saw in what file? AppDelegate.h. So we declared a property called window, and that property was of what type? It was of type UI window, capital UIW window. Okay, and it was a star, which means a pointer there too. So self.window, and again, for those following along at home here with laptops, feel free to download the source code from the course's website so you can toggle back and forth among these files if you would like. So self.window is effectively invoking a method. Which method? The setter. So this is one of these pieces of syntactic sugar that you get with Objective-C. We could implement this same line of code by literally calling setWindow as the setter method that we get automatically by declaring a property. But one of the purposes of properties in Objective-C is just to simplify our code so that we don't have these damn square brackets all over the place and very traditional method calls. It's just so much more readable, just like in JavaScript, to have this dot notation and then an assignment operator, the equal sign, right next to it, which effectively invokes that setter. But it's syntactic sugar in that underneath the hood, this is just a message being passed to an object to set some value. But it reads much more clearly this way. Self.window is going to be assigned what value? All right, so well, someone else, what does this chunk of highlighted code do for us? OK, it allocates a UI window object. I don't really know what that is just yet, but it sounds like something that's useful to have, a window for my application, so I'm allocating it. I'm not calling init, though. I'm calling a slightly differently named method, init with frame. And this, again, is largely a human iOS convention or Objective-C convention. Init is typically the default method that you'd call to initialize an object. But if it makes sense programmatically to initialize an object with some arguments, the convention is to call it init, then capital letter of whatever it is you're adding to the object. So use camel case. And init with frame, I don't know what a frame really is, but it seems to be related to the screen and the screen's bounds. So let's look to the right-hand side there. The value of this argument, so to speak, is going to be the result of what? Calling UI screen main screen. So I'm not calling alloc here. Turns out this is a class method called main screen that apparently, if we read the documentation, is returning effectively a pointer to an object of type UI screen that represents the only screen on my device. So the screen is, you think of it as the glass. Meanwhile, that glass is a fixed size. So when I pass the message called bounds to this UI screen object, what do you think bounds returns? Yeah, the dimensions, the height and the width, effectively, which is going to be a little different if it's an iPhone 3 or an iPhone 4S or an iPhone 5, depends on the device, or an iPad, depends on the device potentially. And so this is a programmatic way of getting myself a UI window, which we'll see is like a container. It's just a special UI view. It's the parent of all other view-related objects on my application. I'm just initializing it dynamically, so I don't even have to know in advance what size of screen this is going to support necessarily. So a long-winded way of explaining just how you get access to a window, which again is going to be a big rectangle that we can start putting all of our buttons and text fields and keyboards and all of that on the screen. Now, this is just a comment. Override point for customization after application launch. So this is just someone at Apple wrote this comment for the rest of the world to just kind of know where we could start plugging in code of our own. And we'll get to that. But now let's see what happens after. Why is this program's background white? Apparently because of line 3 here. Self.window.background color gets UI color white color. So here too, we have some conventions. Self.window is the property that's referring to my window object, whatever that is. It's a rectangle, a canvas on which we'll paint other objects. .background color, this too is a property. And I know that because of the fact that there's a dot there, honestly. That's my clue that this is another property associated with that object. And meanwhile, UI color, I'm going to guess is a class, just because it's capital U, capital I, capital C. It's following the conventions that Apple has for class names. What kind of method is white color, apparently? So it appears to be a class method, because if UI color is a class, and we're not calling alloc, the only other way to talk to a class without having an object is through a class method. So white color is apparently a predefined message that I can send to the UI color class and get back some representation of white. And maybe it's effectively a number like FFFFFF. It's something like that that represents the color white, however Apple implements it. Now, I'm getting a little tired of taking myself for taking my own word for it. So let me try a little trick of Xcode here to start digging in. If I go and hover over UI color, let me zoom back in, while holding Option, notice that this is clearly a keyword of interest, and notice that my cursor has become a question mark. So this is one of the nice features, honestly, about Xcode. It's probably, of all the IDEs I've used, Eclipse and NetBeans and others, it's honestly probably the best. It's unfortunately pretty much designed only for Apple programming, but it's a really nice IDE in part because it's very instructive. So if I now click on UI color, notice that I'm going to get a little pop-up, and a lot of IDEs have this. So this isn't something too new, but I get a nice description. A UI color object represents color and sometimes opacity, ... It's been available for quite some time, since iOS 2, so several years ago. It's declared in a file called uicolor.h. So in answer to your question, can't see the actual implementation of this, but I can see the header file and any constants or methods or other things related. Here's what's of interest. The Apple documentation is actually pretty darn good. So if I click on UI color class reference, this program called Organizer loads, but this is just an embedded web page. It's an embedded Safari instance, so the same documentation is available on Google. And just to confirm as much, let me do UI color reference. Sure enough, first hit is on developer.apple.com, and that's the same exact page. So realize you don't even need Xcode to poke around. So let me increase the font size and poke around here. There's a few things to keep in mind when navigating Apple's documentation. And we won't do this ad nauseum. Let's just use UI color as a simple example of how to navigate the docs. It inherits from NSObject. So that's kind of cool. We've seen how to do that in code. This is just the documentation's way of saying it. Conforms to. Conforms to what? What are those three blue words apparently examples of? Those are three protocols. NS copying we've seen. Turns out there's other things, NS coding, NS object, whatever that is. If I clicked on them, I could learn more, but I'm not too interested in that just now. This is part of the UI kit framework, but we kind of guessed that earlier from the UI prefix. Declared in, all right, somewhat interesting, sample code. So this is where I've never been a fan of Apple's code. A lot of their sample projects are way overcomplicated for newbies, so I would generally advise not diving into something like a Quartz demo, which is a fairly sophisticated graphics demonstration, and looking instead to online tutorials or books or the course's own sample code, because I think you'll often find Apple's code overwhelming. But feel free to poke around if you'd like. And now here's some standard vanilla stuff. So some English prose explaining what it is. For some reason, Apple calls methods tasks in the documentation, but tasks just means methods. The ones that are prefixed with a plus means they are what types of methods? Class methods. You can call them without instantiating an object with alloc. The minus symbol prefix means it's an instance method, so you have to allocate the object first. Apple does not exactly alphabetize them. They essentially categorize them into some arbitrary but generally helpful categories, creating a UI color object from component values, initializing. So honestly, Command F will be your friend quite often. When you're looking for something that you remember part of the name but you can't quite think of it, reading through the documentation can be a little tedious because of the arbitrary way they sort and I mean, there's absolutely no sort order to this thing, as best I can tell. But there's white color. So if we click on white color, notice that it's also a plus, so it's not a property. It's a method that gets passed to an object, message that gets passed to an object, and there's its documentation. And let's consider this as representative of the rest of the docs. Returns a color object whose grayscale value is 1.0 and whose alpha value, which